Welcome to Vision in Action Live. We have a presentation today on the business of you and a discussion with David Enevoldsen, who's a lawyer, an inventor, and author of Emotional Embuffication. He also resides as an expert at Thoughts of Abundance, LLC. Welcome to Vision in Action Live, Mr. Enevoldsen. We're happy to have you here. I'm Jim Boswell. I'm your host and the author of Lifelong Fulfillment, Take Charge of Your Life. Today's presentation, The Business of You, is a discussion that translates business training, coaching, and business rules into the personal from which they were originally derived so that you can use them for your own purposes. So looking at this further, if you think about it, businesses are no different than any business institution, organization, or human enterprise that you know, patronize, respect, or despise. In other words, we're all humans, we're all doing this. So why would you ask yourself the question, why would a business principle apply to my personal life? Well, every dimension of your life maps to every business activity. The difference being is they have deep pockets and deep resources, and they are very focused on results. And because business is a human enterprise, you can translate that into an individual advantage. So many times you'll see these coaches who say, hey, I coach businesses. Well, everything they have to say is about human interaction anyway. And so some of that would be good for your management of risk, reward, investment planning, and all of the above. So let's dig into this a little further. So if you agree that business is a people thing, then you would want to agree that it enables your proficiency and your learning curve to be better than it is today. So businesses, again, are most focused on efficiency. They're focused on results. The term return on investment, which you've heard us use here at Vision in Action Live in the context of lifelong fulfillment, is exactly the same thing. They're focused on money and so forth. We're focused on a balance of values that are personal, but it's no different. So they spend a lot of money, and you can capitalize on the money they spend by paying attention to the lessons learned coming out of their training, execution, and indeed, even sometimes their failures. And you put that in your experimental laboratory about your own issues as you move forward and develop your own lifestyle plan. So let's look at some of these so that you can translate a business perspective into a personal one. So let's talk about basic economics. Well, that translates directly into personal competency in personal economics. And all of us need that regardless. There's not a day when we're not going to be handling a dollar, a yen, or whatever medium of exchange that's available. Differentiate or die. We'll skip down to that one. That's how to focus your personal value proposition. What makes you different, special, interesting, and of value to other people and other activities? Something like naked statistics. Well, this helps you in the factual decision-making mode and personalizes it, but it uses numbers to help you make those kinds of decisions. The one I like also is many people forget that a price is not a price. If you believe in negotiating, this teaches you how to personally negotiate to a positive answer. Maybe it's yes, maybe it's maybe, and occasionally it's no. But you do it without fear or trepidation or hesitation. So the next time you buy a car, you're going to be a lot smarter in how you buy that car. Next time you buy a house, you'll be a lot smarter about that as well. Let's see some more of these. So let's talk about saving capitalism. Robert Reich, who was in the government back in the in the government as a Department of Economics. He was dealing with US-based stuff, and that informs what we actually do in terms of functioning in this economy. So the US economy dynamics affect individuals, and if we pay attention to saving capitalism, we're paying attention to our own self-interest. The 80-20 principle, this is another mathematical thing we talk about as the Pareto rule. And the personal focus on what really matters can get out of hand if we don't have a way to refocus it. This in particular will help you. The counselor seller is another way to show how persuasion that helps others succeed directly helps us succeed. In other words, the time that you make your customer successful is the time that you are being successful as well. And then you look at the millionaire next door. This is entrepreneurship for individuals, and it gives you lots of lessons learned and things to think about if you're going in that route or are so inclined. Let's look at a few more, and then we'll stop. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Around since 1989, is kind of old, but it really is pretty good about talking about effective personal habits that you might want to be using. The Paradox of Choice, right above it, by Barry Schwartz, talks about the efficiency and focusing of your personal life, in that too many choices just get you locked up in a decision loop that's difficult to manage. And the minuscule differences between the solutions don't really matter at the end of the day. So if you look at why the secret to success is setting the right goals, this talks about how to set personal goals. Same process applies. It's just your personal issues relative to business issues. And then rules of thumb, how to stay productive and inspired even in the most turbulent of times. Well, every rule of thumb in business has a counterpart in the personal realm. So this can be your entrepreneurial personal thumb rules that you want to have in the back of your brain. So as you go forward, you'll have a better chance of getting the best results. Let's take a look and sum up on this. So what would happen if you internalize these same things in the realms of economics, psychology, math, finance, and operations? You've heard us say time and again, all of these are important to a well-rounded, focused life where you're doing personal development. Some of the things you might learn in the process of doing that is, project management under a PERT CPM. You might learn how better to manage your own constraints and resources in practice and over time. And you might get a lot better at generating SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. So it's worth your effort. At least we think so here at lifelongfulfillment.com. And now's the time in our program when we hear perspectives from point solution experts and people leading self-directed lives. Today's discussion is going to be on a concept called embuffination. And leading up to that, I want you to help me welcome David Enevoldsen. He's a lawyer. He's the inventor of the concept and the author of Emotional Embuffination, and an expert at Thoughts of Abundance, LLC. Mr. Enevoldsen has certifications in neurolinguistic programming, cognitive behavioral therapy, and as a life coach. Welcome to Vision in Action Live, Mr. Enevoldsen.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. So I've made that introduction. I may not have completed everything of key for the audience. If you'd like to, please feel free to amplify on that.
Sure. Maybe I can just give a little background because I think it gives some insight into what I'm doing. So I've worked as an attorney primarily in family law. I've also done a lot of criminal law, and I've been doing that for well over a decade now. And I also had a bachelor's degree in psychology. And so when I'm working on all these divorce cases and custody fights with children, I was very frequently seeing people just completely unravel. Understandably, it's one of the most trying and challenging times in anyone's life to go through a divorce or severe breakup or fight over your children or something like that. But at one point, I ended up going through my own divorce. I have kids. And I suddenly found myself doing all the same things that I was seeing clients do all the time. And I became an absolute mess. I kind of went through this period of like serious suicidal depression. And eventually I kind of came out of that, and through the help of a lot of different people. Once I was kind of clear of that, I was feeling good. Then I started looking back and I was saying, okay, what happened there? And how can I kind of direct this back to other people I'm working with, clients and others who are going through really challenging times? And I started realizing I think there's a lot of things that we just make way more difficult than they need to be. And sometimes we enhance problems just by the way we're approaching them. And so I started this whole project of emotional embuffination, which is the idea is you're becoming emotionally buff, or you're working to become emotionally buff enough to overcome any conflict in your life and maximize positive feelings. And so I ended up writing a book. I've got a podcast, well, actually several books, podcast, all sorts of different resources, a card game, various things. And they're all directed at kind of enhancing the way that we approach problems and maximizing positive feelings all the time. That involves a lot of things. And one other aspect of that, as you touched on, is the law of attraction, which became a pretty useful paradigm for me as I was kind of going through my own recovery and in continuing to improve my life in various ways. And so I think there's different ways you can look at the law of attraction. If anybody's not familiar with it, it's this idea that your thoughts ultimately manifest in some way in the real world. So if I'm constantly dwelling on, poverty, for example, I start to manifest poverty. Or if I'm constantly thinking about wealth, I start to manifest wealth, or sickness or health, or whatever it is. And so all of these things were really helpful to me. And the Emotional Embuffination Project is just me trying to put them together and hand them to other people so that when they're going through challenging times in their lives, they don't have to deal with worse stuff than they really need to. That's the idea.
Right, right. Well, the law of attraction is more about the thinking side than the doing side, or am I wrong about that?
Well, I think there's kind of a debate on that, actually. I think a lot of the focus for the law of attraction is on the thinking. I just sit around and think. I actually kind of argue with that concept. In fact, I just wrote a book. I haven't published it yet, but on the law of attraction. And one of the chapters in there is about action. And to me, action, I think, is sort of an integral part of the law of attraction, insofar as to me, it's like a coordination of mind, body. I sort of think of human beings as a merger of kind of the cognitive and spiritual, if you will, sides, plus the physical. Like, we are corporeal beings, we exist here, we have a physical nature. And so if you're going to look at it in a very spiritual way, as you can. And you can look at the law of attraction in a very practical way or a spiritual way. I think it's useful no matter which end of the spectrum of that you're on. But if you look at it in the more spiritual sense, we are sort of this merger of, in my mind, spirit and physical. And so if we are partially physical, I don't think you can necessarily ignore that, especially if we're trying to synchronize those things. So I would offer that if you're going to effectively use the law of attraction, it's almost a reflection of what's going on in your head to coordinate your actions. For example, if I walk up to you and I say, hey, here, I'm going to give you this $10 bill. You don't actually receive that unless you extend your hand out and take the $10 bill from me. And so in doing that, there's this coordination of like me thinking I'm receiving that $10 as I'm extending my hand out to receive the $10. And so I think that branches out into other realms, though. If I want to become really wealthy, then I don't sit around on my couch and just do nothing. In fact, from a law of attraction perspective, I like to say I am becoming the person to whom wealth is drawn. I become the magnet in a sense. And in order to do that, in order to become that other person, I have to take some action. I have to do things to get myself into the position that's going to make me that CEO or whatever it is that's going to draw that money in. And so I would assert that there is action is an important element of the law of attraction. And I think if you want to be complete, you have to have all those elements synchronized, both thinking and what you're doing.
Right. And another aspect of the law of attraction that I thought was interesting is that it seems to tend to concentrate one's focus on maybe one thing out of your life that has priority over all other things. So driving you to maybe be more monomaniacal, shall we say, about one thing, as opposed to having what, the old classicists talk about as the well-rounded life.
Yeah.
What do you think about that one?
Well, and I think that's a real danger. I'm not sure if that's necessarily an affect of the law of attraction per se, so much as the thinking. At least this would be my thought, as the underlying thinking about what you're putting your focus into. Sometimes if you do become sort of obsessive about a particular type of thought, that can branch out into other things. For example, if I'm constantly thinking about how I need to be better than everybody else, like that underlying thought can ripple into problematic other realms or cause you to ignore other realms. But I would completely agree that I think you do need to have some level of balance, in terms of how you're thinking, law of attraction or otherwise. If I'm totally fixated on being wealthy, I might become wealthy, but then ignore my happiness at home, or something to that effect. So I do think it's important to have some level of balance, especially when we're talking about emotional states and regulating all of that and managing conflict. I mean, what's going on at home is an important element of that. So I do think that you need to be balanced and pay attention to the different realms in your life and make sure that they are all operating effectively.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more about your invention, emotional embuffination, and how that relates to responsibility and so forth. Maybe you could walk us through some of that.
Sure. So in the chapter, you mentioned absolute responsibility. Excuse me. In the book, I said in the chapter. In the book, I have a chapter entitled "Absolute Responsibility," and the idea that I have there is it's kind of a product of something I was seeing all the time in family law and still see everywhere in criminal, family, and even outside of the law. Typically what happens is when something goes wrong, something we don't like, most people kind of immediately jump into trying to figure out who's to blame for that thing. So I don't like this situation. I say, well, this is your fault. You did this to me. And then I start to react from that place. And I start to either attack you or try to run to somebody else and say, he did this to me. And most of the time that doesn't really change anything. If anything, or if it does change it, it makes it worse. And so this idea of absolute responsibility is that when I am confronting a situation I don't like, if things are going haywire for me in whatever way, no matter how justifiably I can point the finger at somebody else, I don't. And I say, I take ownership of this situation. And the whole idea is I'm trying to reorient the way that I'm thinking about it, because if I just point the finger, I start blaming everybody else and I don't change anything in me. On the other hand, if I say this is on me, even if it was clearly a malicious act that I'm suffering from, I start to say, all right, was I not seeing this thing coming effectively, and so maybe I need to change my approach to that? Was I not maintaining effective boundaries with this other person? What did I do that I could have done differently that's going to alter the outcome if I run into this situation or a situation like this in the future? And the theory is that by doing this, I'm now starting to change what I'm doing. And if I can change what I'm doing, even if it is legitimately somebody else's fault, then I reduce the possibility that this is going to happen in the future, and I increase the possibility that I'm going to deal with this more effectively in the future if it happens again. And another part of this problem is that most people, no matter what is going on, I have seen people contort the weirdest situations that are so obviously on them into it's somebody else's fault. So the whole idea here is we're just trying to reorient our thinking so that we're not just automatically pointing the finger, fireballing things out of control and otherwise not fixing the problem, and instead say, okay, it doesn't matter what happened, it's on me. And if it's on me, I start to change things to fix it. And if I can change things to fix what's going on, I'm more likely to have a better life in the future. That's the idea.
Right. Right. So how does that roll into the embuffination?
Well, emotional embuffination is about a couple of things. One is conflict resolution. And so that plays directly into the conflict resolution. If I'm fighting with somebody and in whatever manner, either physically or just by argument or whatever, if I start to blame them, which is what most people tend to do. I mean, you see this constantly in like the family law universe, but I see this in criminal too. If everybody loves to point the finger at the cops or the government or the terrible rules or the legislators or whatever. But I mean, it extends well beyond the law. I see this all over the place. Everybody wants to say this is everybody else's fault. And generally speaking, that inflames situations. If I come on and I say, Jim, you did this to me, you're a jerk, I need to like tell you how you're wrong, then in that situation, typically you're gonna, I'm not saying any of that, but of course,
I might react poorly to that.
well, that's the point though, is you're going to get defensive if I start approaching you that way. And I say, you made me feel bad. And I'm going to tell you why you're a terrible person. You're going to say, this wasn't me. This was you. Like, and then you're going to react. And then I'm going to react even more. And all of a sudden we're in this huge argument and it's gotten worse. And so to the extent that we're talking conflict resolution, this is very much about how do I solve the problem that's right in front of me without inflaming things. So that's one part of it. And the other element there is the emotional management part. And one of the concepts that I have another chapter on this particular concept, but one of the ideas is we want to set ourselves up for success in every realm as much as possible. And so in order to do that, we are limited beings. We have finite willpower. There's some really interesting studies on this exact thing where they kind of show that you can only maintain your focus for so long on something. So a lot of times people just want to willpower their way through stuff, but we only have so much of that. And so I think you really have to be able to pick your battles. And if you are living a life where you're just constantly on this roller coaster of everything is a struggle all the time, when some really big struggle comes along, you have way less left in your reservoir of energy, so to speak, to deal with that problem. And so if we can kind of get in the habit of setting ourselves up in a way that the day-to-day moments are not just constant struggles because we're not managing all these little things well, then we have a lot more willpower left over for the problems when they do arise. And then we can handle those more effectively. And that in turn spills over into, I'm going to feel better most of the time. And when I do run into these problems, I'm going to handle them and feel better with those as well. So that's kind of the underlying idea, is just we're trying to set it up in all realms, no matter what's going on around us, such that I feel better all the time. And when the problems do come along, I'm effectively resolving them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if you're acquainted with Dr. Kahneman, who works in behavioral psychology, but he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh, yes, yes.
And so he was making a distinction between the system one brain, which is our instinctual and emotional brain set, and the system two brain, which is a little hard to get motivated, but it's your logical brain, the one that can do analysis, the one that can, what we might want to term rational. And it seems like a lot of our default is we are at heart emotional beings. Our system one brain is immediate, instinctual, and it's designed to protect us without doubt. And a lot of this sounds like it reverts back to how do we manage that transition? We'd like to be in system two, where logical, rational, we think about what we're doing, but a lot of times we get forced back in to the emotional. Right. And it sounds like you're addressing that pretty much head on.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Their emotions are fascinating things. And I think we tend to feel them regardless of what's going on, regardless of how you're thinking about it. I've had some really interesting times in my life where I feel like I'm in crisis and I'm watching my emotional states and can't seem to manipulate them in a direct sense. And, I have another chapter in the book. I keep referencing chapters in my book, but there is another chapter in my book, which is chapter 5, where I kind of talk about the function of emotion. And there's some really fascinating studies that have been done in various ways. One of the most influential to me, there's a book by Dr. Antonio Damasio, excuse me. I was thinking of the wrong book there for a second. So Antonio Damasio wrote this book called Descartes' Error, and he's a neuroscientist, and he did a lot of work with people who've had kind of damage in their brain that would impact emotion. And so a lot of his patients would come in and were just experiencing no emotion whatsoever. And almost invariably, what you start to see is that people cannot function when they don't have emotion. And it seems to me that a big part of that is what's happening. And I go into this in the chapter 5 of my book. But it seems to me that what's happening is emotion helps us to prioritize things. And in prioritizing things, we say, okay, this thing is important or this thing is not important. And so I can throw more attention at this or not throw attention at this. And it's sort of this integrated thing that happens all throughout our bodies. And so we can kind of look at these emotions because we have these kind of, I mean, going into the thinking fast and slow stuff, we have kind of different ways of analyzing what's going on, but it's really hard to override the existing emotions, and they're designed to protect us in various ways, as you indicated. There's a fascinating example in Descartes' Error, that book, where he talks about this patient that he had come in who had damage to his brain such that he wasn't experiencing emotion anymore. And they, at the end of this session, they bring him out and they say, okay, let's schedule your next session. And they say, you can pick this day or this day. There's like two options. And then he proceeds for, I think it was like half an hour. He's sitting there going back and forth saying, well, if I go on this day, there's this advantage and this advantage and this disadvantage and this disadvantage. If I come over on this day, and so he literally is just going back and forth for 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. About all these, this unending calculus of which day he's going to pick for this next appointment. And finally, the staff like get irritated and they're like, "Just pick this day." And he's like, "Okay." But the point of that, I think, is that, and this is what often happens when we don't have emotion, is that people get into this unending calculus of decisions and they can't choose anything. Emotion helps us to say, "This is important." That family member over there is about to get murdered. Right. I'm going to have an emotional reaction that says, that's an important thing. I need to take serious action and drop everything else right now. That's kind of an extreme example, but we have all these kind of gradations down from that. And because that's so integrally intertwined in our system, you can't really override it. And in fact, emotions will frequently override what we're doing. Sure. But I think we need to acknowledge them and their importance, and not a lot of times other people talk about this contrast between, we need to just think rationally all the time and use that reason to overcome emotion, that kind of thing. I would actually assert that we sort of accept the emotion, acknowledge that the importance of the emotion. And interestingly, when you're in moments of crisis, this is what I've discovered, by acknowledging and being okay with the fact that I'm feeling something, and actually lessens the intensity of the emotion that it's having over me. Because otherwise I start to say, well, I'm upset right now and I shouldn't be upset. And then I get upset about the fact that I shouldn't be upset. So now I become kind of doubly upset. Right. We can think about, there's these different ways we can approach things. And I think the habits that we're developing and the way that we're analyzing things when stuff is calm are going to influence how we react in those moments of crisis. So we do need to think about the different realms of it. I do think we need to acknowledge and accept the importance of the emotion, because we wouldn't function with it if we didn't have emotion. And so just accept how it is, do what you can in moments of non-crisis to set yourself up so that in moments of crisis, you're going to manage them effectively. Another example I have I keep referencing the book. Another example I have in the book is one of like working out. So I have analogous to this kind of emotional management idea, is this idea that you're constantly working out your emotions. So you're working on it. You don't go to the gym once and say, all right, I did curls for 30 minutes, so now I never have to work out again. Like, people go on a regular basis, right? And they keep making themselves more and more fit. And so I always assert that emotional regulation is kind of the same thing. You don't just do it once. You don't just read a single book and say, all right, I'm done, and I never have to work on that again. You like continually work on it. And so with that in mind, if a moment of crisis comes up, I am wherever I am. If I get into a physical fight with somebody, for example, my physical body is wherever it is. Like, I don't have time to step back and say, I'm going to do a million crunches and push-ups and then make my muscles big so that I can engage in this fight. Like, your body is whatever it is in that moment. And in the same sense, your emotions are whatever they are in the moment of crisis, and your emotional regulation and that sort of thing. And so the important thing to me becomes to do all that back end work when things are fine, so that when the crisis comes up, you're spending all that time in the gym so that when you get into the fight, not that I want you to go fight, but just as an example, like if you're in that situation of physical crisis, you're already strong enough to handle it. And similarly, if you're in these moments of emotional crisis, you're strong enough to handle it because you did that work beforehand. So I was a little long-winded, but that's kind of my thoughts on the
practice.
Yes, 100%.
Okay. Well, we're getting toward the end of our time, and I wanted to ask if you had any parting comments for our audience, something that you want to share with them.
I think one of the big things I would offer is kind of just what we were just now talking about is that, there is so much that goes into managing emotions and conflict. And to me, it's this complex web of stuff that you're just constantly working on. And so I would assert just keep working on this stuff. Like however you're approaching it, just keep experimenting, keep studying, like dedicate some time in your day or week or whatever so that you're regularly improving and approach life in that way with conscious understanding and just keep making things better. I mean, that's the only way you're going to effectively manage conflict in a long-term sense and make your life better.
Okay. And where might people reach you if they need to, or reach your book?
So you can find the book on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. You can also look on my website for that. I have several other books on there, guided journal, card game, podcast, etc. You can go to my website, which is embuff.com. That's embuff.com. When you're there, you can see stuff like the podcast, which is also available on a lot of the podcast directories. So just kind of find your favorite podcast directory, and it should be on there if it's one of the common big ones. But if you can't find it there, go to the website and you can find links to everything.
Exciting, David. Thank you for sharing this with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Been a pleasure. Well, folks, that's our episode for the day. I want to thank our guest today, Mr. David Enevoldsen. Fascinating perspective, and all of us could use that, I think. Vision in Action Live podcasts are every week, and generally they're announced in advance. You'll find that our podcasts are constituted based on presentations of important personal development material from Lifelong Fulfillment, as well as interviews with subject matter experts and people that are already leading self-directed lives. These will give you direct examples about how lifelong fulfillment and personal development works. Check out the newsletters on the website for details on the podcast, the book, Lifelong Fulfillment, collateral materials that'll help you with your own efforts, and everything else at lifelongfulfillment.com. If you want to leave a comment or a question, feel free to do so, and we'll respond accordingly. Again, thanks for watching. We look forward to seeing you again on Vision in Action Live. Until then, smooth sailing, everybody.